So if you would open to Ecclesiastes, we'll talk through the book this morning, and some of the key themes that are present in Ecclesiastes, why I believe it's a very relevant and important book for us to study through. And so Ecclesiastes is one of the wisdom literature books in the Old Testament. Psalms is kind of looked at that in a way. It's very poetic, but there's a lot of wisdom. Proverbs for sure is a wisdom book. There's much wisdom written down in Proverbs. And the same here, Ecclesiastes is a very unique book. It's like the writer, who is Solomon, takes his whole life experience and condenses it down into just this book. And so it's a very interesting book as we read through it. You'll see as we study it, you'll see. But verse 1 of Ecclesiastes says, "The words of the preacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem." And then it goes on in verse 12 to say, "I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem." So here we're introduced to the author, and I already said it's Solomon. Solomon was the son of King David, who was the king of in Jerusalem. And if you know the history of David, Solomon was not his firstborn, or even who knows how many exactly children David had, but Solomon was the chosen heir that David appointed to be king and after him. And there was quite a bit of contention within his own children at the end of his life. But we know from the Old Testament that Solomon became king after his father. As you read in 1 Kings 2:12, it says, "So Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established." Now, had you read the history just leading up to that, you'd been like, boy, this isn't going to go well when David dies, because there was a lot of fighting within David's family, his own sons, and they were trying to establish themselves as kings. So it's very interesting. You see the providence of God establishing Solomon, right? Setting it in order where it says his kingdom was firmly established. And you see the same thing recorded in 1 Chronicles 29:23 and also 2 Chronicles 1, verses 1. So it is for us Solomon who's writing this book, Ecclesiastes, and it's a letter of great wisdom which Solomon, again, he acquired through his observations and what some would call experiments in life. Right? Like he experimented in all these different ways throughout his life, and he acquired a lot of this wisdom, which he's now recording. Solomon, if you read through Chronicles or Kings, you see that he was an exceedingly wise, was very great, wealthy king. He prospered Israel, the kingdom, very greatly in his time as a king. And he was extraordinarily influential. I mean, beyond compare with anyone in the world, probably since. Kings from all around the known world, that part of the world, would come and visit Solomon just to hear his wisdom for themselves. And likely they came to hear his counsel and get his advice on how they should do different things within their kingdom. How Solomon did it, how he, greatly benefited and grew their kingdom. So Solomon was a very, very influential king. And we too have much to gain from Solomon's learned wisdom. If we would take these principles in which Solomon teaches us, we will certainly be spared much grief and trouble in life in many, many ways, as we'll certainly learn as we go through. So there are, you could almost look at it like there's 9 different themes in this book. 9 themes. But one theme that runs central through the whole book and through all of these other themes is that the root of life's problems, all of life's problems, comes down to this, is what he says in verse 2. Vanity of vanities. All is vanity. So that's life's problems, is all things in life are vanity. It's like we're trying to grasp at something with our hands. No matter how much we may try, you can't get it, right? I mean, you go outside on a foggy day, and you try to grab the fog, and you can't do it. It's like, well, it's right here. Why can't I grab it? You get a bag, and you try to put it in the bag, and you don't get the fog. Why? Because life is something that you cannot seem to grasp, no matter how hard you try. And the harder you try to grasp life, the quicker it escapes through your hand, through your clutch. And so this book journals Solomon's struggles with the futility or the vanity of life in these following different areas. The first one being nature. He struggles with nature, the vanity, the futility of nature itself. Second thing is knowledge and wisdom, this earthly knowledge that the people in the world, and even he possessed and tried to gain. He struggled with the vanity of knowledge and wisdom. He struggled with the third thing, pleasure, the vanity of pleasure. The fourth thing, materialism. Fatalism, which, if you're not familiar with the word, it's where if the end is already determined, then why try at all? That's the view of fatalism. If the end is known, if we know the end, why try? Why do anything? Right? So he struggles with this idea of fatalism also. And then he goes on to egotism, which is an incorrect value of oneself and one's opinions and one's thoughts. Solomon placed himself as the most important person in his world, and indeed the whole world, and that's egotism. He was very egotistical. And then he concludes, even this was vanity, right? Like self-seeking life is vain also. And then, interestingly, he struggles with religion, right? And a lot of people if you just go to church, if you just do this, your life it'll all come together. But Solomon, it's like religion itself is vain. If we just practice religion, that in itself is vain. The next thing, number 8, if I pursue wealth, if I try to get all the wealth that I can, just like we read in Psalms this morning, if I make all this money, if I acquire all this wealth, what good is it? It's just vain. Somebody else is going to collect it at the end, right? After my life, let's say I gained $100 million my whole life. I can't take it with me. Somebody else is now going to be responsible for it. What if they don't tend to it the way I wanted to? Right? And if you've ever watched a drama TV show, you know that as soon as somebody passes and gives their wealth off, the whole family's divided because they're arguing about who gets what and how they get it and how they spend it. And well, this person didn't spend it the way I thought, and he's not respecting Dad's wishes or whatever. Right? So even wealth is a vain thing. He struggles with wealth. And Solomon was probably the wealthiest individual earth has ever seen. And we think today, well, there's some very wealthy people there that doesn't touch the actual value of wealth that Solomon had, whether it was horses or gold or anything, livestock. I mean, you read through Kings and Chronicles, and it'll blow your mind how wealthy this man was. And he says at the end, it's vain. It's vanity. It's like grasping at the fog. It's like trying to grab the steam from a teapot. It's just pointless. Gaining all this wealth for yourself is pointless. There's no point to it. Even morality, just kind of the last thing he was writing about and struggling with. Even morality itself, kind of like religion. If you do all the good things, right, and that's your goal is to do the good things, even that's vanity. It's vain. It's pointless. It's futility. And yet, though Solomon struggles with life's vanity and the vanity in all these things, he finds ultimately true wisdom. I mean, this is a man who, when God came to him himself and said, Solomon, I'll give you anything. What is it? He says, I want wisdom and knowledge. And so God bestowed upon Solomon great wisdom and knowledge. And he struggles all his life seeking wisdom of the world. Right? Pursuing all these things as though those things would what? Give him joy, would give him fulfillment. So in the end, Solomon finds ultimate wisdom. He finds true wisdom, and he writes in chapter 12, verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. All of it. Let us look at this whole thing that I've just written, everything I've just written. Let us look at all of it. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. This is everything for man. Nothing else means anything if you don't do this. This is the rightly ordered priority in life. God. Obedience to God. Right relationship, right standing with God is supreme above all else. Right? Just like Jesus says, what does it gain you? What does it profit you if you gain the whole world but lose your soul? Solomon experienced that physically in his own life, really experienced that. He gained everything. He benefited. He just clutched everything. Everything a person could want, Solomon had. And yet he was completely empty. He was destitute in his heart and his soul. And he was far from God. And though this book seems, on its surface, if you just skim through this book, it seems very pessimistic, very negative towards the world. Pessimism is like tending to see the worst aspect of everything. And a quick reading, right, you see that. It's like, boy, he's very pessimistic. He's not. Right? When he says all things are vanity, vanity of vanity, all things are vanity, that's not a pessimistic statement. That's reality. It's like if you're just pursuing the world, if you're pursuing these things, it is hopeless for you. There is no hope for you in any of these things. So it's not pessimistic at all. Solomon very beautifully constructs his arguments all throughout this letter, culminating in what we read in chapter 12, verse 13. Why? Because for a rich and full life, it is only found in right relationship with God. That's the wisdom that he gained from all the wisdom he had, from all the earthly wisdom he sought, from all the things in the world he desired and he pursued and he gained. That's what he realized. That right relationship with God is the only source of fulfillment for our lives. I already mentioned this, but in 2 Chronicles 1, 7-12, you read where Solomon was given the opportunity to make a request of God. And in this request, he asked that he would receive wisdom and knowledge. And yet, even his wisdom and knowledge became vanity. Vanity. That's weird, right? He writes in chapter 1 of Ecclesiastes in verses 16-18, if you look there. He said, I communed with my heart, saying, look, I have attained greatness, and have gained more wisdom than all who were before me in Jerusalem. My heart has understood great wisdom and knowledge. And I set my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I perceived that this is also grasping for the wind. For in much wisdom is much grief, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. Think about the Garden of Eden. Think about the consequence of Adam and Eve taking of the fruit. It's not that they didn't know right from wrong, but they didn't have a personal knowledge of evil and wrong until they ate of the fruit. Their eyes were opened and they fully experienced evil for themselves and sin for themselves, and it corrupted their nature. They knew evil right? In a very intimate sense. They knew sin in a very intimate sense. And Solomon says, hey, I sought with my heart, looking for all these things, knowledge and wisdom and greatness. And I found it. My heart knows wisdom. And it knows madness. It knows folly. And all these things are just like grasping for the wind. Why? Because in much wisdom is much grief. How much grief fell on humanity when Adam and Eve sinned? I mean, immeasurable grief. Right? Immeasurable, continual, constant grief and heartache, pain, suffering fell on humanity because of sin. And he's saying, the more you search for the wisdom of the world, the more you search out and pursue the things of the world, and the more you gain the things of the world, even if it's wisdom and intelligence and that you gain from academia and all these places, it culminates in grief and sorrow. Why? Because those things do not fulfill you. They do not rescue you. You cannot run to a degree for rescue. You cannot run to $1 million for rescue. You cannot run to any of these things for rescue. The Old Testament, the Bible, repeatedly says that God is a fortress. He is a stronghold. He is a place of shelter. He is a place of resting. Nothing else. God. He is the source of all fulfillment and all safety. And Solomon, he searched all the world for all the things in the world. Why? Because he was looking for fulfillment, and he found it only in God. After he pursued every other avenue. I mean, this was a king. He could do whatever he wanted. So he probably went to the extremes and all these things. I mean, just count the number of wives he had. He didn't hold back in any area. I guarantee you, he was as wild as they came, pursuing the world and all these things. And he says, they're all empty. There's nothing in them. It is only a right relationship with God. I mean, James writes in James 4:3, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly. Why? That you may spend it on your pleasures. Did Solomon, when he asked God for wisdom and knowledge, do you think he asked for it seeking for his own pleasure? I think at the moment when he asked, I don't think he did. I think he had genuine, right motive. Why? Because he wanted to benefit his kingdom. He wanted to benefit his people so that he could rule his people well. However, has Solomon experimented and sought to search out wisdom, as he says in verse 13? I set my heart to seek and search out wisdom by concerning all that is done under heaven. Right? As he sought to search out this wisdom from the world, he found himself walking far from God. And he also found himself the object of God's anger. Why? Because God had given him a great gift and he used it wrongly. Right? We can use a gift that God has given us and not please God. Why? Because we can use it incorrectly. Solomon, he used his knowledge and his wisdom, and he got very rich. He benefited the kingdom prospered, but he angered God. Why? Because he did not use it the way God had desired for him to use it. Why? Because he walked in futility. He walked in the ways of the world. He followed after other gods. One of God's commandments for the kings, they should not marry women of other religions, of other nations. Why? Because there was the proclivity to follow after their gods. And you see this happen. 1 Kings 11:9 says that the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel. And why? Because he followed after the gods of his many wives. Right? He did not pursue God. He did not desire the relationship with his God, who revealed himself to Solomon more than one time. You'd think, oh, if God just came to me and I saw God and he revealed himself, boy, I'd be on the straight and narrow. Well, Solomon, God revealed himself 2 times to Solomon, and yet Solomon still decided to follow these little trinkets that his wives from foreign nations brought in. And so Solomon writes this letter to us. And for all his wisdom, he walked away from the source of wisdom itself. He sought meaning and purpose in the things of the world, only to be completely dismayed and let down and hopeless. So let us learn from Solomon these next few months. Let's take his warnings and calls to do what? To fear God and keep his commandments. Why? Because then we'll be walking in the true wisdom that only comes from God. Just like James says, ask. If you lack wisdom, ask for it and God will give it to you. And Solomon here tells us what true wisdom is. So let us take hold of this true wisdom. Let us walk rightly before God, obeying him and looking only to him for our fulfillment. Because if we look to anything else, we're just going to be let down. We're going to be dismayed. It's going to be like trying to chase the wind. Let's not do that. Let's heed the advice of somebody who did chase the wind and found no hope.